மறக்காம சர்ப்ரைஸ் பண்ணுங்க. Thank you.
Welcome to Chapter 6, which is going to be all about Zugzwang. Now, Zugzwang is probably a term you have heard before, and it really is one of the most important and absolutely fundamental concepts, not just in Endgame studies, but in the Endgame period. So this chapter is going to be focusing on exercises and puzzles that use this idea of Zugzwang in order to actually win the game. Now, Zugzwang refers to positions where one side is actually forced to worsen their position, and in many cases even lose the game, simply because they have to make a move. It's part of the rules in chess, and it's actually one of the most important rules in chess, that you do have to move something every single turn. Because of this, the position always changes in some way, and Zugzwang is the idea that you can use this to your advantage in certain cases. Now, the really cool thing to me about Zugzwang is that many endgames cannot be won without this rule, the idea that you have to make a move. And take this basic king and rook checkmate, for example. This is an endgame which would actually be a draw if the black king was allowed to simply pass, not make a move whatsoever. But because the black king has to make a move each and every time, white is able to use this to slowly force the king to the edge of the board and eventually deliver a checkmate. And from this position, white actually has a very elegant mate in two that I really think drives the point home. It's a very nice and pure mate. White actually wins here. There's many ways to win, but the fastest way to win is to play the move rook to c6, or rook to c5, or anywhere on the c file, rook to c1. The point is that after any of these moves, white is keeping the c8 square under control and forcing black's king to move into the corner. Of course, white can also win by moving the rook along the 7th rank. It would just take a couple more moves, as black's king can try to escape for a little while. So it's much faster to keep the king cut on the c file, and it's a nice kind of demonstration of the power of Zugzwang. So as you'll see in the puzzles in this chapter, this is going to be all about trying to understand what the opponent's next move is and how you can take advantage of it. So here we have an instructive example. This is a well-known study by Richard Reddy, who composed a number of great studies. And I really, really like this one just because it's so pure and it's so elegant. And it's actually quite surprising that white can win this position essentially by force. Now, to quickly evaluate what's going on here, white currently has an extra pawn, but the material is very much reduced. And if black is able to win one of white's pawns, for example, with a move like king to b5 and going after this one, then the bishop will be able to sacrifice itself for white's last f-pawn, and the game will be easily drawn. So white actually has to be very, very precise to win this endgame. If we start with a6, for example, which seems like the most natural move, black will play king to b6. And if we play knight to b4 defending the pawn, black can just harass the knight with a move like bishop to f8, and we're going to be losing the a6 pawn. And once again, once we're down to just one pawn, those endgames are typically going to be very easily drawn, as the bishop can always give itself up for our last pawn. So this one is not working for white. And instead, the solution starts with the move knight to d4 check. Now, this move definitely makes a lot of sense. We're checking the black king. And here, black's king is forced to make a decision. Now, king to b7, kind of going backwards, is not really the critical defense here, as here white can actually take this pawn on h2 and win this endgame with the 2 extra pawns. If we go back to the starting position, taking on h2 in this case would not work because black just goes king to b5, wins the a pawn. But once we've thrown in knight d4 check, king to b7, now white can just take on h2 here. For example, black can play king to a6, white will play knight to b3, and it's going to be very, very difficult for black to dislodge this construction, as white is then able to just advance on the king side with king g3 and f4. So this variation is winning for white, and instead it's much more critical for black to simply immediately go after the knight with a move like king to c5. King d5 is not as strong because then white can just push the pawn forward, and if king takes d4, a7, and this pawn is just promoting. But after king c5, white can't really push the a pawn forward, because if a6, black will simply play king to b6, pick up the pawn, and draw the endgame. And so this is now the critical moment. After this check, black's king goes to c5, where white has to figure out what to do. If we play knight to b3 check in this position, Well, here black plays king to b5, white goes king takes h2, and compared to the previous endgame we saw where black's king was on b7, here black's king is actually a lot more active. And amazingly, black is in time to hold this one. Bishop f4 check, white's king starts advancing, the bishop drops back to defend against the a-pawn, and amazingly, black is actually in time here. King to g4, king b4, white's knight on b3 is under attack, has to get out of the way. If it does, then the a5 pawn is lost, and black is making a draw. And if white tries to just run the pawns forward, for example with f4, then black is just in time to take the knight. White can push this pawn, black's king comes back for the a-pawn, a6, king to b5, and here white's simply not in time with the pawns. For example, f6, black takes the a-pawn, f7, bishop d6, and the bishop has covered the pawn. Or if we go back 2 moves here, if white throws in a7, for example, still not in time. The bishop takes it and gets back to c5. So in this variation, black is able to actually hold the endgame. So if white tries knight d4 check, king c5, and knight b3, then black is playing king to b5, and because black's bishop is in time to stop the a-pawn and then go after the knight on b3, black is holding this one. So how does white actually win the endgame? It doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. If knight f5, for example, hitting the bishop, black will play bishop to f4 and then go after the a-pawn. And so we find ourselves in a very tough situation here, and that's what makes this a very difficult but also really beautiful study. And the key to solving this one, and the key to solving most of the puzzles in this chapter, is to ask a very, very critical question. And that question is, what is the opponent's next move? This is a question that is going to be very, very important to continually ask as you kind of work your way through these puzzles, because it will give you a hint as to what you need to do next. So if we ask the question here, what is black's next move? At first glance, it seems silly, but it actually is not so easy for black to find a good move. The knight on d4 isn't really hanging, because if king takes d4, white is going to be pushing a6, and black is not in time to catch the pawn. So the knight on d4 isn't really hanging, and black's king on c5 actually doesn't really have a lot of good moves. b5 is covered by the knight, c6 is covered by the knight, b6 is covered by the pawn. So the only thing this king can do is to actually get further away from the pawn. But if king d5, then once again, white can push a6, and actually black is not stopping the pawn. The a-pawn is just running. So black's king is kind of stuck. But okay, it's an open board. Seems like the bishop should have a lot of moves. But once we start looking at the bishop's moves, we notice that bishop to g7 runs into knight e6 check. Bishop f8 also runs into knight e6 check, losing the bishop. Bishop g5 is also a blunder. Bishop f4 also hangs the bishop because of knight e6. Then if we try bishop to d2, we see that white has knight to b3 check, winning the bishop. And same for bishop to c1. Again, knight to b3, picking up the bishop. White will still have at least one pawn left on the board, and white will have a winning endgame. So as we take a closer look, we realize all of a sudden black's bishop has no moves here. Every move is mined because of a knight fork. So the king doesn't really have any moves. King takes d4 is not a threat. The bishop doesn't really have any moves. The only move black is left with is to just push this pawn forward, promote the pawn, and allow white to take it. And then after that, black will be kind of out of moves once again. So as it turns out, since black's king and bishop, since neither piece can move, this is what gives this potential Zugzwang idea. And it turns out that white's best move here is this move king to h1. I mean, really an amazing move. I was really shocked when I first saw this study, because it's pretty much the last move you would expect to be correct in a puzzle. But it's such an ingenious idea, stopping black's only semi-normal move in the position, which is to just give up the pawn, and leaving black in total Zugzwang. Now the king, again, can't move without allowing white's a-pawn forward, and the bishop can't move without getting forked by either knight to e6 or knight to b3 check in case of the bishop coming down to c1 or d2. And just like that, black can basically resign, because black is just in Zugzwang, has to make a move, but every single move allows white to either promote the pawn or win the bishop. For example, king takes d4, a6, and black is not stopping the pawn. A really incredible puzzle, such a beautiful idea. King H1 always has been one of my favorites. And this example is, of course, a little bit more complicated than the rest of the puzzles you'll see in this chapter. They're going to be easier and kind of slowly work their way up to the more advanced ones, but it's just such a nice demonstration. Also highlights this theme of domination, which we'll be discussing in the next chapter, as it seems like it's a completely open board, but in fact, Black's bishop here is kind of being dominated by the knight, because on every one of its squares, the knight has a fork to win the piece. So yeah, really beautiful puzzle. I hope you enjoyed this one as much as I did. And let's take a look at one more example before I leave you to solve the rest. So this is puzzle number 3 in the chapter, and it's White to Play and Win. This is a study by Korolkov from 1947. And at first glance, this actually looks like a drawn endgame. Normally, rook versus bishop with no pawns on the board is a theoretical draw. And here it's Black that has an extra pawn. But in this exact position, White has a very nice and elegant way to actually win the game using this idea of Zugzwang. So the most important thing here is to, again, ask this question, this really critical question: what is the opponent's next move? I mean, this is really important. First, it's, of course, also important to look at the forcing moves, but once we take a look at rook to e5 check, we see that's not really leading to much after king to g4. We really have to start looking at other ideas. And this is where it's really critical to ask this question: what does the opponent want to do next? And it's not so clear what Black wants to do next, but the bishop on h4 seems to be a little bit lacking in mobility, and the bishop doesn't really have any good squares to go to. So Black's next move, we can think, might be king to g4 to open up the bishop, or king to f5 to attack the rook. And if Black's bishop is able to get out of this precarious situation on h4, well, then Black is just going to be totally fine. Again, rook versus bishop is a pretty easy theoretical draw. So this is the challenge for White. We have to find a move that prevents Black's idea of getting the king out with king to g4 or king f5, and then getting the bishop out as well. So how can White do this? And if you'd like, I'd encourage you to pause the video and think for yourself for a couple minutes before returning and reviewing the solution. Okay, so the right move here for White is this really nice move, rook to e4. Simply cutting Black's king, of course not allowing king g4 or king f4, any of these moves, but also stopping king f5, because of course this bishop on h4 is under attack. And just like that, Black is completely lost. Black has no good moves in the position. And this is, again, a really nice demonstration of Zugzwang, because White doesn't actually have a threat in this position. If it was White to play here and we played the move king to h3, Black would just go bishop f2, and in fact the position would be drawn. White would not be winning that one. But because Black has to make a move exactly here, it turns out that Black is losing this game. The bishop has no moves, and the king has to let go of the bishop if the king moves. So a really simple solution, but one that can really evade a lot of players, because we're often thinking about solving puzzles in terms of looking at the most forcing moves and the most forcing ideas. And now this chapter is going to challenge you to actually think more about what the opponent wants to do on their next move, and how you can try to prevent that or make it difficult for them to achieve their idea. So with that, I'm going to leave you guys to solve the rest of the puzzles in this chapter now. Once again, really make sure to ask this question each and every time you're solving: what is the opponent's next move, especially if you're feeling stuck. And hopefully this will help you solve the puzzles from here on out. With that, I'll wish you the best of luck, and I'll see you in the next chapter. Take care.
மறக்காம சர்ப்ரைஸ் பண்ணுங்க. Thank you.